Welcome to week 3 peer tutoring. Today we're going to be looking at the spinal tracts. So in order to do this, there are 3 key things we're going to look at. Firstly, we're going to look at a review of CNS anatomy. Then we're going to move on and look at a cross-section of the spinal cord before we look at our long fiber tracts. There are 3 tracts we're going to look at: the dorsal column medial lemniscus, the anterolateral tract, and our corticospinal tract. So the first part of this tutorial, we're going to do a quick recap of our central nervous system. So our central nervous system is made up of our brain, or cerebral cortex, our cerebellum, and our brainstem, made up of our midbrain, pons, and medulla, and then our spinal cord. For the sake of this tutorial, we're going to focus on the spinal cord. So if we take a cross-section of the spinal cord, there are 2 key things that we want to note. First is the orientation. So we want to know which side is dorsal and which side is ventral. And the second thing is the parts of the cross-section of the spinal cord. Our white matter on the outside, made up of myelinated fibers or axons, and our grey matter on the inside, made up of namely cell bodies. Within our grey matter, there are 2 key areas we're going to focus on. Our dorsal horn, containing cell bodies of sensory interneurons, and our ventral horn, containing cell bodies of motor neurons. Before we move on, there are 3 key definitions I want to get out of the way. The first is ipsilateral, meaning on the same side. Secondly, contralateral, meaning on the opposite side. And then to decussate, which means to cross the midline. So going back to our outline for today's tutorial, we have successfully reviewed our CNS anatomy and reviewed what a cross-section of the spinal cord. So now we're ready to move on to the main part of our tute, which is looking at our long fiber tracts. First, we're going to look at our dorsal column medial lemniscus. This pathway takes information of touch, vibration, and proprioception from our periphery to our cerebral cortex. Hence is an ascending pathway. So what happens is we have receptors in our skin, namely Meissner, Merkel, Pacinian, and Ruffini receptors, that take this information and transmit it into electrical signals via a primary neuron. This primary neuron has its cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion and enters through the dorsal side of the spinal cord. It then ascends to the caudal medulla. In the caudal medulla, there are 2 nuclei where it can synapse, either a cuneate nuclei or gracile nuclei. The cuneate nuclei is located laterally and takes information or sensory information from the upper part of the body, above T7, whereas our gracile nuclei takes information from the lower part of the body, from below T6. In the caudal medulla, our primary or first order neuron synapses with our second order neuron. This second order neuron travels up to the ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. In order to do so, it initially decussates via the arcuate fibers and then travels up the medial lemniscus before reaching the thalamus. In the thalamus, it synapses with the third and final neuron in this chain. This neuron projects directly from the thalamus to the somatosensory cortex, transmitting the message of touch, vibration, or proprioception to the brain. Quickly to recap, this is a 3-neuron pathway. Our first neuron taking information from our hand all the way up to the caudal medulla. The second neuron decussating, taking information from the caudal medulla to our thalamus, and our final neuron taking information from the thalamus to the somatosensory cortex. Alright, so going back to our outline of today's tute, as far as our long tracts, we've firstly looked at our dorsal column medial lemniscus, and now we're going to move on to our anterolateral tract. Alright, so our anterolateral, or otherwise called our anterospinal tract, conveys both pain and temperature sensation from the periphery to our cortex. Hence, like our dorsal column medial lemniscus, is known as an ascending pathway. So, like we had receptors in our dorsal column medial lemniscus, in our anterospinal tract we have free nerve endings sitting in our skin. These nerve endings belong to both A delta and C fibers. The nerve endings transmit either pain or temperature via an electrical signal in our primary neuron. So before we move on, I quickly want to compare A delta and C fibers, both of which convey pain and temperature. So our A delta fibers are fast, whereas our C fibers are slow. Our A delta fibers are myelinated compared to unmyelinated C fibers. And A delta fibers convey sharp pain and cold temperatures, whereas C fibers convey duller pain and hotter temperatures. Okay, so going back to our pathway. Like our dorsal column medial lemniscus, our anterospinal pathway is a 3-neuron pathway. The first neuron, as we mentioned before, has 3 nerve endings in our skin. These fibers, A delta and C fibers, travel into the spinal cord via the dorsal root ganglion where the cell body lies and into the dorsal side of our spinal cord cross section. From here, it will either directly synapse or travel up 1 to 2 spinal segments before synapsing with our secondary or interneuron. This secondary or interneuron immediately decussates or switches sides before traveling up to the ventral posterior nucleus of the thalamus. Here, our secondary or interneuron synapses with our third order and final neuron of the pathway. This third order neuron travels all the way up to the somatosensory cortex to convey either the pain or temperature that was initially detected in the 3 nerve endings. Alright, so going back to this week's outline, so far we've looked at the dorsal column medial lemniscus, the anterolateral system, and now we're moving on to the corticospinal tract. Alright, so the corticospinal tract is a little bit different from the 2 we've been talking about before. This only has 2 neurons in the pathway and is sending information from the motor cortex down to our muscles, hence is a descending tract. Starting at the motor cortex, we have our first neuron, or our upper motor neuron. This upper motor neuron travels down all the way until the lower medulla. In the lower medulla, we get our pyramidal decussation, where our first neuron, or upper motor neuron, crosses the midline. After the pyramidal decussation, it continues to travel down the spinal cord until the level of the relevant muscle group it wants to innervate. At this level in the spinal cord, it synapses with the second neuron, or the lower motor neuron. This lower motor neuron projects out of the spinal cord into the periphery and innervates whichever muscle group is relevant. So, to recap, we have 2 neurons, our upper motor neuron, which generally sends down inhibitory signals, and our lower motor neuron. So if we take this information and look at what would happen if we had lesions in either our upper motor neuron or our lower motor neuron. As our upper motor neuron is an inhibitory neuron, if we had a lesion in this motor neuron, we would get increased tone, hyperreflexia, clonus, a positive Babinski sign, and spasticity. In contrast, if we had a lesion in our lower motor neuron, which is generally excitatory, we would get decreased tone, hyporeflexia, no clonus, and a negative Babinski sign. We would also see fasciculations and fibrillations, as well as atrophy of this muscle. Atrophy could also potentially occur in an upper motor neuron lesion, however this would occur over a much delayed period. So just to recap, today we have reviewed our CNS anatomy, then we've taken this anatomy and focused on a cross-section of the spinal cord, and then used this to look into our 3 major long fiber tracts, our dorsal column medial lemniscus, our anterolateral system, and finally our corticospinal tract. Thanks for joining us in week 3 peer tutoring. That's all for this week, and we will see you next week.